Hello, welcome to Chapter 3. We're going to look at dependencies and actually some real software design issues here. Chapter 3 introduces some concepts that we'll be covering later on in the chapter. It covers a fair amount of stuff, but in a very brief manner. The idea is that in later chapters, we'll be spending a chapter on a lot of these different areas. So it introduces concepts. First, we're going to talk about this kind of dependency and layering, how to structure software, larger software projects, so they're a little easier to maintain. Hopefully you've seen some of this in the last sample sprint where you had to check out code from GitHub and make changes of it, and you may have run into conflicts where you made changes and someone else in your group made changes to the same file, and you either had to coordinate that who was making changes at the same time, or else you had to merge the conflicts and things like that. So that's a common problem in software, is managing these this kind of conflicts. Some systems will actually look at ways of having breaking the code up so that each person owns their own code, or no people don't touch other people's code. But today's modern design systems tend to uh, set up where everyone's modifying the code in different ways. So let's talk about some ways of organizing code. So chapter 3, we'll get started talking about dependencies here. And what a dependency here, this talks about a client class working with a service class. This can be thought of as kind of the typical client-server relationship, but it really is more like a one object creating another object and using that object inside its class here. And so then this object needs to have this other class available for it to work. And we want to minimize, we don't want a whole lot of dependencies in our systems. So we're going to create a sample console application here. So we're going to go in the console application and create that, name it simple dependency, and set that up. So why don't you, I find that students sometimes learn if they follow along here. So if you are in Visual Studio, create a new class, make it a console application, and we're going to call it simple dependency or something like that. Uh, and set that up. So let's look a little bit on how we have that. So they have this library that you can set up and work with. It actually has some more code into it. We're going to actually try to build that a little bit. So they're just talking about looking at what this class depends on or references. Now, I'll just warn you that this chapter hasn't been updated even in the second edition and still is based on Visual Studio 2015, I believe. So things will look a little different as far as the Visual Studio pictures. Microsoft has changed a lot. So right now I see a dependency area, not references here, and sometimes I will see references depending on how this is set up. And then I just see my main program here. And again, dependencies and references have been simplified here, so I don't see as much. Okay. Um, so let's also add this console read key to our thing. The idea is that we want this program to be running here, and if we just run this one program, this doesn't, the hello world will print and just hang there possibly. And so I'm going to add another line here. I'm just going to say enter any key to quit, and then do this console read key, and it'll just sit here until it reads a key from the keyboard when I run this. Okay, so that's how I've got this program set up, really basic here. And now I can run this, and it asks me to look at some things running, and that might be a little challenge for us. So let's first run this. So my program's running. See, it says enter any key to quit. It's sitting there waiting for me to press a key. And now I can see what things are running. If I go under debug, and since it's running, I can see a lot of things under debug. and I can see modules. Now, I believe if you have the community edition, you can't see all this stuff. And again, there's very few places where we need to see this, and we're just talking about it here. So it's fine if you have a community edition, just follow along with what I'm showing you. But all we're seeing is that there's a number of DLLs, dynamic link libraries, loaded up, and that our program needs all these dynamic link libraries available to it to run. So it has dependencies on all these built in. So that's what they're talking about here. And we're going to create our own DLL and see how it's linked in. So we're going to create a message printer DLL in just a sec. So before we go on and create message printer, let's just talk about ways of structuring this software. So, oops, I better stop this. There we go. Okay, so now we have a program. I could make, let's say I wanted to make another class to control accounts, an account controller class, so that people have to log into an account before they can print or something like that. So, okay, so we want an account control class. We could just make another class here right next to this one, but often you might have 20 or 30 classes eventually. You want to organize them. So one simple way is just to group them in folders. So I can go up here and I can add an item and new folder. Sorry, new folder's off to the side there, but it's there. And then I can just say maybe I want all my account files into one folder here. I'm going to close dependencies up here. Okay, so I have my account folder. Now I can add items to that folder. I can add a new item and a C++ class, and I'm going to just add an account controller class. And so I can group these classes inside folders. So that helps somewhat, but this all builds at the same time. And again, if I were to build this, it takes a while to build, and I have no code here. And as I get to larger projects, it can take maybe sometimes 10 minutes to build. So it all builds together whenever I build one off, and I have to compile the whole thing. And again, we change things and check them out. There are just some issues here with this all being in one area. So we can look at breaking this up. So maybe, often one Scrum team will have one project here, and I'll work in that project, and that works fine. But if you have a couple Scrum teams working on different parts of your product, you may want to break it up in different ways. And one of these is to use dynamic link libraries here and add those in. So let's look at that. So we're going to add let's jump back here, message printing service here, a class called message printing service. And we're going to add that. And we're going to make it so up here, rather than adding a new class, oops, not quite that far. Here, I'm going to add a new item. Oops, I think I did add new item at the too high a level. So I'm going to go down here in my solution and add a new item there. Let's see how that goes. Add new item and see what options I get now. Okay, so that looks better. So rather than adding a class or an interface, which we'll do at times. Okay, I'm sorry, I keep doing this wrong. So we're not going to add an item. We want to add a new, so this is a solution, and there are projects inside our solution, and this is a project. So I'm going to add a new project. So I'm going to go up here, click on the solution level and say add, and then one of the things is a new project here. So I'm going to choose a new project. And there are different types. We'd create a console app, but now we're going to create a class library here for us. So just a class library. And again, I'm going to call this the print services library, or just print services, and I'm going to create that. So now I'll have at the solution level, I have two different actual projects, and each one of these will be compiled and run somewhat separately here. So that's how this is going to be set up with this message. And so I'm going to make a message printing service inside this other project here. So under this solution, product, project. Here, I'm going to add another class. So add a class, new item, add a class, and then this will be called my message printing service. Okay, so again, to get these different projects, to make a new project, I went up and did a add. I had to click on the very top solutions, new project, not new item. And then I could find the class library and add this as a class library. Okay, and that's how I made this new thing. Now, when you have multiple full projects or here under your solution, one is set up as the main project with the executable in it, and that's the one marked in bold. So that's why you'll see one bolded, and that should have a main routine in it. Like this print services is just libraries, and none of these will have a main here, and this is the one that will be run by default for us. Okay, so let's go jump back to our textbook. And again, they're just going to add a simple line to our print services. We can do that. So go and do print services, add a print service message there. Got that. Now let's try to run that from our main program. So we're going to declare a new variable, print services here, and set that up. So they're using this var, which means a generic variable, but I don't like that, and a lot of companies don't even allow that here. So we're going to go back into our main program here. Where is our main program? Okay, and we're going to declare how do we actually make a new print services? So this is a message print service class. So how do I make an object of that? So I say message print services. I say print service equals, and then I'll say new message print service and call the default constructor for that and set that up here. So that's what I'm trying to write here. But again, it's bold facing this because it doesn't know where it is, because now we're in this program here, and it's referring to an object in another solution here, not another solution, another project within the same solution here. And it can't find those. And so again, I can show some potential fixes here, and one of them will be to generate a new message print, a new file, generate class, and that sort of stuff. But we want to actually add this to our program up here. So we're not finding message printed services, and you're going, oh, we probably have to put using in here, and you're wondering why isn't using even an option here when I look, and usually one of that's options. So it could say maybe it's in a different solution. So you can say just using, and again we will reference the namespace here. So what is the namespace over here? It's print services. So I'm going to reference that using print services here, and you think, okay, that should solve this problem. That should make this seeable here. But again, now this isn't even found. Namespace could not be found, and this is not finding that. So the problem is that we're referencing a dynamic library that's not in our current project, and we need to add that. So in our excuse me, in the simple dependencies under dependencies, we're going to add a dependency, add a project reference. And there are different types of project references. So we'll eventually add, we can add some different libraries in here and things like that, and shared projects and stuff. But right now, by default, it just shows our project, different things in print services list, the only one listed here, and it's not checked. So I'm going to add that and say OK. So now listed under our dependencies should be within our project print services here. So now we have that added to a dependency. Now once we have that, print services is shown here fine here. Oh, and so now we get this the new message here that message services is not public. So I'm just going to make sure that this is a public class here, because we're referencing outside of our solution. Okay, and then everything should be fine. I'll just warn you that this is a little different than, but very similar to what's in the textbook. So the textbook will walk you through this. So it talks about creating this simple class, introduce dependencies, and using that here to do things, and then talks about this framework and how frameworks are loaded, where it is. It looks at these different dependencies that can be loaded in here. And then it talks about this dependency graph. So we'll just come back. But that's the idea here is that our program now references using this using method, and in our dependency area here, this print services project. So this project is now dependent on this project here. So that's how we have this set up. And again, we can then do things. We can now call methods in here. We can say print service dot, and we've got a print message method we can call that's over here, this print message. So, okay, let's jump back to the textbook. Okay, so we can add a library and set up these dependencies, and it just shows these different dependencies are set up here and ways of setting things up. Often you can have, we have these graphs where we can draw these out, but we often use graphs with arrows showing that this is dependent on this, but not vice versa necessarily for this. And these can get very complicated in their whole systems for managing these dependencies in software packages. You see this a lot in like Python, in Linux, and things like that, where if you bring in one software package, it has to load in often 20 different software packages for which it's built into. So there are whole systems of managing these package management software systems that manage all these dependencies and things like that that you will have seen. So. And again, different software systems will decide how much granularity, how small to make their little packages and assembly in different ways. And so we're not going to deal too much with this. There's also a problem of cyclical dependencies, where one project will depend on another, which depends on another, and it depends on another. I remember once opening up the Open Computer Vision, Open CV library. It depended on another library, and that seemed to depend on another library. And there were some issues there. I thought that depended on this first one, but I didn't have the right version of this available. Also, you get into a lot of versioning issues, where this version of this assembly needs this version of another assembly, or another package which might need a different version of another package, and it's hard to get the versions of all these packages running correctly. So okay, we're not going to worry too much about these more complicated systems here, recursive call or anything like that. So we're just going to talk about managing dependencies. And what is the term patterns and anti-patterns? So a pattern is a common structure for a set of classes, libraries. An anti-pattern is just a common but not very good way of structuring a set of classes for you to work with. So let's talk a little bit about interfaces. Again, I think it's the next chapter is just all devoted to interfaces basically and implementation. So right now we're just going to do a brief scan of what interfaces are. So right now we don't have an interface here. We're just declaring a message library here. And so then we'll look at how to maybe use an interface here in just a sec. This introduces this code smell, which is used like a number of times throughout this textbook. And the idea is that some code just smells bad. Kind of idea is that it just doesn't work very well, and it's hard to maintain and work with. So it's just colloquialism for bad smelling code here. So okay, so let's look at how we instantiate objects and then how we move this into an interface in some ways. So we're going to look at our account controller object here and set that up. I think we actually, when we were creating simple things here, let's get rid of dependencies, under accounts, we created an account controller class. I'm going to go back to that class, this account controller class here. And we're going to put in some code in here. We're going to have a constructor here and another class. I'm actually just going to copy this stuff over into this class. So I'm going to have a security service object here. And I'm going to have an account controller that's going to access that security service object and create that. Now, sometimes we put code with HTML stuff in it, and we're not doing that right now, so I'm going to get rid of that HTML stuff there. And then inside this account controller class, we're going to have a change password method, and we're going to set up a user and set that up. So now, in order to build this, I'm going to need to create a security class and a user class eventually. So there's a couple ways of doing this. I can just actually go in here and choose to generate a user type. So it'll create an internal class for this if I want. But I'm going to want to do an external class. The other one is you can change user to user ID and refer that and set that up in a different way. But let's just create another class under accounts. I'm going to add a user class. So just make a user class. I'm not going to put anything in that class right now, but now my account controller will be able to handle that here. And now within a set of users, I want to have a group of users together, so I'm going to create a user repository class here and set that up. And so it says you want to generate this class in a separate file now, and I'm going to say that sounds good, just do that. So now under accounts, I have an account controller, I have a users and a user repository, and the idea of the user repository, it would be just a maybe an array or a list of all my users, and I'd maybe be reading that in from a database or something like that. So okay, so let's talk a little bit about this code here, and we are creating a new user repository and a new security system here. And we're just doing these standard constructors. We're calling the constructor, and we call this instantiating an object. We're calling new and instantiating an object. And we're going to look at ways of avoiding that. You're going to say, how do we do code where we use objects but we never instantiate them? Well, we're going to try to limit where we instantiate them for a couple reasons. One is to help with testing. Right now, this code here would be very hard to unit test. In order to test this code, we need to have a security system. We need the security software system available for the test, and we also need the user repository available for the test. So it's very hard to test this one class without having these other classes available here. So we'll look at ways of setting that up. So this talks a little bit about that the account controller is always dependent on these two other classes. And then we're having some difficulty doing what we call unit tests, where a unit test would just test out this one class independent of everything else, and it would be hard to write unit tests here because of this dependencies here for us. And often when we get to we'll talk more about unit tests, we'll talk about stubbing out or making sample versions, and it's really hard to what we call stub this out or substitute a fake security system in here just for testing, because of the way this is structured, where we're just instantiating it directly. So we have this kind of problem with these dependencies in their system. So there's also some hidden dependencies possibly in here. So in our security service, we might be using this code to get a session. So if we go back here and we're creating a security service. So let's add that class in. Okay, so we have another class for that. And oops, in that we'd have a constructor there, and we'd just have it call this other system. So where's our security services class? Oops, that's not right. So again, we might say, well, give me a session from this session factory. And this actually might work from a different place. And if you're familiar with some different code libraries, especially with interfacing with databases, you might realize that that's code from a library called nhibernate. Nhibernate is a common library for accessing database systems and taking SQL queries and converting them into objects, or taking objects and converting them into SQL things. So it's what's called an object relational mapper. Maps our objects, our class object files into SQL queries and vice versa. That's out there. And so again, there's an implicit, so our account controller is implicitly dependent on Hibernate. So again, thinking back to this sort of system with all of our graphs here, we've got our account library here. Let's see this. So we've got account controller. It's using security services and user repository. So it's dependent on user services and account repository. Is that what I just said? Security services and user repository. But security services might be dependent on and hibernate, so that might be dependent on that. So again, we have very little code here, and we can already generate a fair number of dependencies here. And so that's what this is really talking about, is how this code is dependent on lots of different other codes for this. So one way to break this up is to use interfaces. So okay, yeah, so this is talking about the lack of testability here. I talked about that, so I'm going to skip over that again. Talks about an inappropriate intimacy, that some classes just are too closely intertwined with other classes. For example, the user. One question you have to ask is, how much does what does a class need to know? So account controller, that creates a user and passes a user on to security services. So that means that account controller needs to know what a user is, be able to create user objects and send them around. And the question is, does the account controller really need to know that? The user should the user just really be known by maybe the user repository and maybe security services, which is translating user objects into SQL commands. So maybe account services doesn't need to know that. Maybe it just needs to know a user ID. It gets a user from a user ID. So maybe we can move some of this code around so that account services doesn't need to know what a user is. So that's what they're doing now, is they're changing passwords, and then inside the security class, security services, they're moving some of this user stuff, and then accounts is just using a user ID. So the idea here is that we would move this code where we create a new user out of here and stick it into security services. So inside security services here, we would, for now I'm just going to comment out this one because we don't have the nhibernate library actually here. We would just get a user with a user ID, so and set up the user here, and we would just need to know the user ID here. So security services, where it used to change the password, it used to use this. Sorry, let's go back here. User account controller. It used to have this and pass a whole user here for change password. We're now going to pass just a user ID. And it already is given a user ID here, and it just passes it along, and it lets this program manage all the user information, know what a user is. So again, you've got to kind of control which objects, which classes know about which other classes, and where the dependencies are. So we can certainly try to control which objects know about which other objects, and try to limit what objects any given object knows about, and that kind of can control our dependencies in some ways. We can also, when we have to have dependencies, put an interface in their place. So an interface is just a connection between one class and another. So rather than just calling a method in another object, what we'll do is we'll create an interface and put some methods in there and say, it's kind of a generic connection and say, okay, this object is going to provide these methods to us, and this other object is going to use those methods. And what's nice about that is that, like for testing and other purposes, we can then swap out objects that implement an interface for other things. And again, you've seen interfaces probably a little bit, but next chapter I think we'll really delve into that. But we'll just look at a simple thing. So we're going to create a public interface here called iSecurity Service and set up that. So in our code here, and again, I've been copying this from the textbook. In case you don't have an electronic version of the textbook and you don't want to copy this, type this all in because it's not that important of code, I will post this code into Brightspace also next to this video. Okay, so we have our security services here. I've updated a little bit here. I didn't have it set. We have a constructor here, and we were calling this nhibernate thing, but I've commented that out. I've added this change user password here, and that creates a user repository, and it creates a user from the user repository. So the user repository is often a list of or an array of all of our users. Now we given an ID, a user ID, we get the user from that list, and then now we can use that user and call change password here. So this is our security services here, and this is our change password method. And our user accounts now calls that, creates a security service and generates that. But again, we're tied to this one specific object here. And so what we're going to do is create an interface between these. So let's see how this would work. So inside accounts here, I'm going to add a new object and new item, but rather than creating a class, I'm going to create an interface. Interfaces usually start with the letter I, and in this case it's called I Security Services. So we're going to use the same thing here, call this I Security Services, and add that to our class. And again, we're going to just have one method it's going to do. It's just going to call this change password method. So right now, a security service can only provide us one thing, change a password here. And so we're going to set that up. It uses this user ID thing. This is built into our system, so you should make sure you are including that. If not, go to the quick action and do the right and follow one of those that includes GUID as part of your system, I think. Okay, so this is our interface here. And now rather than creating an object of type security service here, we will create an object of type, so we won't do a security service, we'll create an interface object here and use that. So we're just swapping this, so we're going through the interface rather than here. And then our security service then has to implement that interface here. So security services has to implement that interface and says it's going to implement that interface. So security interface has to implement that interface. And again, we'll talk more about that next idea. But the idea is that this security system, or this interface, is a kind of a catch between security services and account controllers. Account controllers creates one of these interfaces for security services, and so it's kind of like a plug or a connection between these two. They both connect up through this system. And what that lets us do is that for like testing purposes later on, we can swap out a different security service here and just a stub one or just a simple one for testing purposes. And so we're not tied to this particular thing. So it kind of separates our classes with these interfaces, and we'll often do that. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this at this point. talking about that and leave the later talk to another lecture.